Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy Contours podcast series. I'm your host for today, Eugene Chausovsky, and I'll be talking to Richard Giragosian about Armenia-Azerbaijan relations and their impact on geopolitical dynamics throughout Eurasia and beyond. Richard is the founding director of the Regional Studies Center, an independent think tank located in Yerevan, Armenia, and is also a guest lecturer for the NATO Defense College in Rome. He has over 35 years of policy experience in the fields of security and international relations, and has served as both a visiting professor at the College of Europe's NATO campus and as senior expert at Yerevan State University Center for European Studies. So, Richard, it's been a little over a year since we last spoke on the topic of Armenia-Azerbaijan relations and implications for Eurasia. And there's been quite a lot that's happened since then. First and foremost, we had obviously the return of Donald Trump to the U.S. presidency in January, which was then followed by a peace agreement initialed by Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan and Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev at the White House in August. And this was also followed by the announcement of the new Trump Route for International Peace and Prosperity, or the TRIP route, which is designed to enhance regional connectivity efforts with the backing of the U.S. So perhaps to start us off, Richard, can you provide a bit of context on what led up to these agreements and what is the current status of relations between Armenia and Azerbaijan?
Well, as you have already noted, this past year has been a significant change in terms of a seismic shift in the geopolitical landscape. But more precisely, in terms of Armenia-Azerbaijan, this past year has witnessed an unprecedented level of diplomatic engagement and progress. However, this was much more than a White House ceremony presided over by President Trump in August. Actually, well before that, it started with the Azerbaijani side, unilaterally deciding that they were satisfied with the text of a bilateral peace treaty, where Baku closed negotiations and returned to a degree of normalcy after a rather maximalist diplomatic position. This was then followed by an unprecedented bilateral meeting between the Armenian and Azerbaijani presidents in Abu Dhabi. This was actually held in July, and the Armenian Azerbaijani leaders worked out much of the agreements that were unveiled at the White House ceremony the following month, which means they get much of the credit. However, it was that groundwork that enabled U.S. President Trump to invite each leader to the White House. And what we saw at that so-called peace summit was, as you have pointed out, two specific deliverables. First was the initialing, but not signing, of the bilateral peace treaty, and that was done by the foreign ministers, not the leaders themselves. But it was eclipsed by a second, much more ambitious project and agreement on connectivity. And this was the so-called TRIP route, literally named after President Trump, as usual, immodestly. But this also paves the way for where we are now. We do see a continuation of negotiations over the implementation of a restoration of road and rail between Armenia and Azerbaijan onto Turkey. But we also see significant behind-the-scenes progress in both people-to-people contact, civil society engagement, and important talks over border demarcation. Now, this was a long answer to a very good short question, but it does reflect the degree of change in this post-war environment in the South Caucasus over the past year.
Got it. Thanks, Richard. Yeah, so a lot of important points that you've made there that are worth unpacking a little bit. In particular, what you mentioned, while we had this very sort of, high visibility agreement initialed, as you said, by the foreign ministers of the two countries, there was a lot of groundwork that was laid well before Trump even came into office, particularly with the resumption of those bilateral negotiations between Armenia and Azerbaijan, which had to cover some very important and not as perhaps exciting things, but things like border demarcation, as you mentioned, and sort of the precursors to a major diplomatic and economic deal that is that followed it or that we're currently in the progress in. So I'm wondering if you can give just a little bit of a perspective from the Armenian side as those negotiations were going on, and what was able to kind of unlock some of the stumbling blocks that we had seen in previous years.
Well, good question. In fact, what we see first in the broader context is a demonstrable de-escalation of the rhetoric and the political discourse from Azerbaijan. There has been a significant climb down in terms of their maximalist positions and preconditions. What we also see from an Armenian perspective is a breakthrough, not just in terms of diplomatic negotiations with Azerbaijan, but a breakthrough in terms of outcomes. Specifically, what I'm referring to is this TRIP agreement, this so-called Trump route for international peace and prosperity. This is not a corridor, and the agreement is most important for ending speculation about a looming threat of extraterritoriality against Armenia's sovereign control. What this also means is a climb down by the Azerbaijani side, and a narrowing of demands and preconditions so that the eventual signing of the peace treaty now only depends on Azerbaijan receiving one core demand, a change to the Armenian constitution. A controversial issue by itself, but it's more important in a broader context to demonstrate the accidental convergence of interests between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And with Armenia going into an election year, this is especially dramatic, but also very significant in Armenia's strategic significance and importance.
Understood. And so, kind of touching on those points that you just mentioned, I'm curious how this negotiation process and these at least initial agreements between Armenia and Azerbaijan has been perceived within Armenia, where you're based. And you also touched upon the parliamentary elections in Armenia that are happening next June. How do you see those as potentially shaping that perception and the current process that we're in, both from a diplomatic as well as from an economic and regional connectivity perspective?
Well, to a degree with this question, I am no longer as optimistic as my previous answers. And what I'm referring to is, in general, what we see is a punitive peace. In other words, a bilateral peace treaty that was unilaterally imposed by Azerbaijan on Armenia. And second, what worries me as an analyst is that the peace treaty plus the agreement on connectivity does nothing to address the root causes of the conflict between these two countries. Moreover, there's no security guarantee, nor any security guarantor. And in terms of a dangerous precedent, the diplomatic breakthrough is still based on a precedent of recognizing, if not validating, Azerbaijan's use of force over diplomacy, and in some ways a vindication of authoritarian power over democracy. So I do think we need to pay more attention to the day after, the implementation, how to ensure a lasting, durable peace. And the good news is the opportunity comes from the connectivity agreement, where for Armenia and the region, a new degree of economic interdependence is the most effective way to regain deterrence and to prevent a renewal of hostilities. And I think we're past the tipping point. It is now much easier to go into the negotiation phase after the more politicized agreements have been accomplished. And I do think in terms of a notable outcome is the exclusion of Russia from this process, which is a tremendous accomplishment for both countries.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll get into Russia and some of the other important external players here in just a moment. But I wanted to just quickly follow up in terms of the domestic political landscape within Armenia. So obviously, Prime Minister Pashinyan has been a very central figure in this whole process of these negotiations, and has, quite remarkably maneuvered between a lot of internal and external constraints into getting us to where we are right now. So do you see the elections coming up as a potential disruption point, or do you see that regardless of the outcome, some of these trends that are currently underway will maintain themselves?
Well, that's a very good follow-up question, meaning I can no longer avoid commenting on domestic politics. But to be honest and candid, I think the government is justifiably self-confident going into the election year. Much of the government's strength, its likely re-election, however, is derived from the absence of any credible opposition. There's simply no alternative to Armenian Prime Minister Pashinyan and his government. And unfortunately, the lack of an opposition is an obstacle to the institutionalization of democracy in Armenia. Nevertheless, we are expecting our third back-to-back genuinely free and fair election. And one reason the government is likely to win beyond the absence of a viable opponent is a deliverable. The government here has now been able to craft a winning political message that Prime Minister Pashinyan and his government have moved Armenia closer to peace and further away from war. And this is very much a welcome message for a population of Armenia and Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh as victims of their expulsion in terms of conflict fatigue. There is a combination of apathy, but also disgust with years of conflict leading nowhere. This is also why nationalism no longer resonates in Armenia. So to answer the question, we expect further progress in democracy, the government's re-election. Unfortunately, we still need the emergence of a more constructive, credible opposition in the country.
Understood. Thank you. So let's get in, as you've already touched upon, the role of external players. So you mentioned how Russia has sort of been removed, or at least diminished from the process, in terms of, Russia previously serving as a mediator between Armenia and Azerbaijan. That obviously did not prove to be effective given the events that we saw, over the course of 2020 to 2023 in terms of the military activity. And obviously with Russia's focus on the war in Ukraine and its standoff with the West, that has opened the door for other players to step in, whether that be Turkey, but obviously Western countries as well, among others. So I'm curious to get your thoughts on what do you see as the role of such external players in shaping the process that we're in currently, and looking ahead as well, how they could potentially, shift, whether that be enhancing the regional connectivity efforts. I'm thinking about things like not only the trip route, but also the middle corridor, but also from a diplomatic and potentially even security perspective as well.
Well, if we look at the map in terms of the vulnerability of the South Caucasus as an intersection, as an arena for competition between rival regional powers, not much has changed from history. However, what we see is a Russia today that remains distracted and overwhelmed by its failed invasion of Ukraine, and has really lost a significant degree of power, presence, and prestige in the South Caucasus. On the other side of that coin, however, we see a dangerous vacuum in the region created by the Trump administration, where American cuts to USAID, Radio Free Europe, Voice of America, has tended to forge a dangerous new vacuum, a gap, if you will. Russia's not filling it, but we do see an increase in Turkey's position in the South Caucasus, looking beyond just Armenia in terms of normalization to the strategic prize of Central Asia. And this is why the current axis, the geometry of the region, is now much more pronounced on an east-west trajectory and much less north-south, meaning Turkey's emboldened, Russia's weakened, Iran is distracted by its own problems, and at the same time, this allows a closing window of opportunity for Armenia and Azerbaijan to engage bilaterally. And it is a closing window of opportunity because there will come a point where Russia returns to the region and tries to regain its lost power and influence. And finally, what we see, I'm very skeptical about the sustainability of the U.S. in terms of the American national interest. I think for Armenia and the region, especially in terms of geoeconomics, it's the European Union that's much more pivotal and critical to the longer term development of the connectivity between these countries. And it's actually the EU that is also less threatening to Russia than, say, direct American involvement. And at the same time, this is very much a validation of the EU's concept of connectivity, in contrast to a traditional American focus on profits and private sector involvement.
Understood. And you mentioned something very interesting, which was the role of Central Asia, which I think is very important to raise here, because the types of connectivity projects and efforts that this Azerbaijan-Armenia peace process and the ongoing negotiations has unlocked, I think it's important to point out that it's not just in the South Caucasus, helping to enhance some road transport and energy connections, from Azerbaijan going through Armenia, potentially. I think it's worth noting here that we saw the first grain shipment, direct shipment from Azerbaijan to Armenia happen, I believe, a few weeks ago, which was quite a momentous occasion. But there's also on the other side of the Caspian Sea, the Central Asian factor, which you pointed out. And here, actually, when I was recently in Azerbaijan for a think tank conference, that happened to coincide with Azerbaijan joining the C5+1, which for listeners who are not aware is one of the US's primary diplomatic outreach efforts, which actually goes back several administrations to Central Asia in terms of a direct diplomacy between the US and the 5 Central Asian states. And now Azerbaijan joining that as the C6+1 or as an observer or participating actor, I think just points to the importance of those linkages across the Caspian Sea to Central Asia and beyond. And this brings in things like the Middle Corridor. As you mentioned, Richard, the role of the EU is important here, those connections between Europe and China. So obviously there's a lot of interplay here between these various actors. But as you point out, the sustainability of the US is a big question, despite these kind of high profile agreements. So perhaps to wrap up here, I'm curious to hear what is your outlook for Armenia and these regional connectivity projects that we've discussed for, let's say, the coming year, both in terms of the biggest opportunities that you see as well as some of the most potent challenges?
Well, if we look over the coming year, Armenia is expected to further demonstrate progress in its democratic credentials. Second, Armenia is endowed with a rare commodity in this region of legitimacy. In other words, more than free and fair elections, it's the institutionalization of democracy that's crucial for Armenian resilience. At the same time, I do think the worst is over. I think a difficult, painful post-war reality, the loss of a war in 2020, the forced expulsion of the Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh, means that the Armenian government was forced to adapt and adopt policies to accommodate a new post-war reality. But the longer-term outlook is especially positive for Armenia, given the pronounced degree of stability, which is essential, especially as all 4 of Armenia's neighbors, from Georgia to Turkey to Azerbaijan and Iran, are increasingly unstable. And Armenia does offer an important bridging role, a platform for Turkey into Central Asia, for Central Asia back to Turkey. We do see Armenia becoming a transit state. And for a landlocked, isolated country like Armenia, that's a tremendous sea change in its geopolitical position. And finally, I think Armenia's change of government in 2018 was a rare victory of nonviolent people power that surprised many. And I will predict Armenia will continue to positively surprise and impress observers through the coming year.
Got it. Thanks, Richard. And just one kind of brief final question here, since you mentioned a lot of the important elements in play, both in terms of opportunities and challenges. I think it's worth just kind of briefly reflecting here how much has changed since we spoke, last year with, not only these high profile agreements that we've already discussed on the diplomatic side, some progress being made on those regional connectivity efforts, but even, less publicized, but I think just as important things like the resumption of contacts on the societal level, including experts such as yourself, which, have, I think, increased their engagement with Azerbaijan, with your Azerbaijani counterparts and vice versa. So I'm curious, with that in mind, and because you're so involved and influential in this process, what do you see as kind of the most important things that you'll be focusing on and that you'll be covering going into this next year for Armenia and for the wider region?
Well, three specific issues. The first is not Armenia-Azerbaijan, as important as that is, but it's Armenia-Turkey normalization. That's the real game changer in the region, and one with much more direct economic benefits. The second issue is also Armenia's diversification of security partners. Since the war of 2020, Armenia has one major arms procurement deal with India, not with the West. This is more of a broadening of security partners for Armenia, which also includes initiatives in South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, for example. And the third issue, most importantly, is to make sure we're able to deepen and sustain the democratic process in Armenia, especially after a distressing retreat by neighboring Georgia, which is moving in the opposite direction, away from European values and democracy. And I do think, again, it's democracy that is coupled with economic interdependence as the only way to regain deterrence. And that way we can stabilize the region overall.
Understood. Thanks very much, Richard. So we'll have to leave it there. If you'd like more in-depth analysis and forecasting related to Armenia-Azerbaijan relations and related topics, please check out our website at newlinesinstitute.org. And I also encourage readers and listeners to check out the work that Richard does on a regular basis in terms of his reporting and analysis on these topics. Thank you very much, Richard. Thank you all for listening, and take care.